Now, I'm not even entirely sure where to start with this video, and at this point I'm guessing a lot of you have already heard or read this elsewhere, how in this new book by Disney CEO Bob Iger, which are basically his memoirs, he writes about George Lucas and his reaction to The Force Awakens, and how Lucas felt betrayed when he realized that Disney wasn't using outlines for the sequel trilogy that he'd sold to them. Anyway, I guess I'm just going to read through some of the excerpts taken from the book, before then giving my thoughts on all of this, and so by all means just skip ahead in the video a couple minutes if you've already heard or read this elsewhere. Okay, so in this book Iger says, at some point in the process, George told me that he had completed outlines for 3 new movies. He agreed to send us 3 copies of the outlines, one for me, one for Alan Braverman, and one for Alan Horn, who'd just been hired to run our studio. Alan Horn and I read George's outlines and decided we needed to buy them, though we made it clear in the purchase agreement that we would not be contractually obligated to adhere to the plot lines he'd laid out. He knew that I was going to stand firm on the question of creative control, but it wasn't an easy thing for him to accept, and so he reluctantly agreed to be available to consult with us at our request. I promised that we would be open to his ideas. This was not a hard promise to make. Of course we would be open to George's ideas, but like the outlines, we would be under no obligation. Early on, Kathy brought JJ and Michael Arndt up to Northern California to meet with George at his ranch and talk about their ideas for the film. George immediately got upset as they began to describe the plot, and it dawned on him that they weren't using one of his stories he submitted during the negotiations. The truth was, Kathy, JJ, Alan, and I had discussed the direction in which the saga should go, and we all agreed that it wasn't what George had outlined. George knew we weren't contractually bound to anything, but he thought that our buying the story treatments was a tacit promise that we'd follow them, and he was disappointed that his story was being discarded. I'd been so careful since our first conversation not to mislead him in any way, and I didn't think I had now, but I could have handled it better. I should have prepared him for the meeting with JJ and Michael and told him about our conversations, that we felt it was better to go in another direction. I could have talked through this with him and possibly avoided angering him by not surprising him. Now, in the first meeting with him about the future of Star Wars, George felt betrayed, and while this whole process would never have been easy for him, we'd gotten off to an unnecessarily rocky start. Iger then also goes on to say in this book, just prior to the global release, Kathy screened The Force Awakens for George. He didn't hide his disappointment. There's nothing new, he said. In each of the films in the original trilogy, it was important to him to present new worlds, new stories, new characters, and new technologies. In this one, he said, there weren't enough visual or technical leaps forward. He wasn't wrong, but he also wasn't appreciating the pressure we were under to give ardent fans a film that felt quintessentially Star Wars. We'd intentionally created a world that was visually and tonally connected to the earlier films, to not stray too far from what people loved and expected. And George was criticizing us for that very thing we were trying to do. Looking back with the perspective of several years and a few more Star Wars films, I believe JJ achieved the near impossible, creating a perfect bridge between what had been and what was to come. Okay, so before I dig into all of this, let me just say that at the very least here, I do appreciate Bob Iger's candor, that he's seemingly being open and honest about all this. Now, is he doing it just to sell some books? Yeah, most likely. But I can still appreciate the glimpse behind the scenes he's giving us here. And it allows us to begin to understand where things went wrong and where their line of thinking failed them. I mean, what Iger says here towards the end about how they wanted to intentionally create a world that was visually and tonally connected to the earlier films in order to make something that quintessentially felt like Star Wars for the ardent fans. We fans didn't want something that looked or even just felt like Star Wars. We wanted something that was Star Wars. It's not the hardest thing in the world to just make something look and have the feel of Star Wars. Hell, I've played plenty of video games in my day, some of them decades old at this point, that gave me the look and feel of Star Wars almost perfectly, and they didn't just copy stuff, they made original locations look like Star Wars. So please don't pat yourself on the back and wonder why George Lucas is sitting there criticizing you when you made our new hero come from yet another desolate, rundown looking desert planet, which you then put some creatures and aliens on and say, hey look, this feels like Star Wars everyone, right? When all you did was give us Tatooine 2.0. And at the same time, don't tell me J.J. Abrams pulled off the near impossible with The Force Awakens just because he connected the old to what you want to do with the new, when decades earlier Timothy Zahn wrote a trilogy of books that actually carried on the work of George Lucas. It'd been a completely new and original story that was Star Wars, not a complete rehash that looked like Star Wars, which is what Abrams basically gave us. And yeah, I get it. The outlines George Lucas wrote probably had some strange stuff in them. Lucas has even told us that the sequel trilogy would have gotten into the microbiotic realm even more, that it would have explored the wills, and he was going to make them these beings who were feeding off the Force. And well, I'm sure you, Bob Iger, as you were sitting there reading all that, depending on how much you even know about Star Wars, I suppose, you were thinking about the prequels and midichlorians and thought, there's no way we're ever going to make these movies like this. Yet, you did buy his outlines and apparently gave Lucas the impression you were likely going to use them. And I'm really hoping this all happened after the initial deal was made or after Lucasfilm had already been sold. Not that before Lucas signed on that dotted line, you were leading him to believe that his outlines would be used, and that's part of the reason why he did eventually agree to sell. That though he was losing his company, he could at least take solace in the fact that the final part of his story would be told in some capacity. Though, let's be real here, I'm not sure how the topic of the sequels would have never come up during initial negotiations. I'd imagine Lucas had to know the very first thing Disney would do with Star Wars is make a sequel trilogy to capitalize off the name and the ability to use the original actors and original characters. Flat out, there's no way you buy Lucasfilm for $4 billion and don't immediately get to work on a trilogy that will help you recoup some of, if not most or all, of that initial investment. And Lucas, of course, had to know that. So I would imagine he was telling you about some of his ideas or offering them up to you from day one, long before he actually sold the company. And so I'm curious to know if you were giving him the impression then, from the very start, that you were going to go with his ideas. I mean, by the fact that he wrote the outlines in the first place and sold them to you, which means you bought them, obviously, it implies he believed from the start that there was at least a chance his trilogy was going to get made. Either way, fully intending to or not, it looks like you misled Lucas at some point and to some extent, and he felt betrayed. Though, yeah, at the same time, Lucas is no stranger to Hollywood and the way things work. He shouldn't have been all too surprised by any of this, which is a sad but true commentary about the nature of your business. And another thing we have to keep in mind here is that this is your own book, and though I again appreciate you even talking about all this when you didn't have to, I suppose, and there seems to be a good amount of honesty here, who knows what you're omitting? Because I'd imagine you wouldn't go out of your way to paint yourself as the villain in your own book. So who knows what really happened or what was said between you two, and maybe what was agreed upon with a handshake, but not written out in a contract. All we know for sure is that Lucas ultimately did sell his company to Disney. He felt like that was where Star Wars belonged if it wasn't going to be in his hands anymore, where it would be treated right and where it would be carried on into the future after he was gone. What we don't know is if anyone with Disney tried to mislead or manipulate Lucas along the way, or if this was more or less a straightforward process that, after the fact, Lucas regretted when he realized what they were going to do with Star Wars. Though, when we consider that shortly after The Force Awakens came out, Lucas called Disney white slavers, I'm going to assume it wasn't just regret setting in, that there were promises he felt that were made that weren't kept. Though, if we're going to be completely fair here, Lucas himself could have made the sequel trilogy if he wanted to, and they would have been done 100% his way. He didn't ever have to sell Lucasfilm if he didn't want to. There were other ways to ensure the future of Star Wars besides selling to them. Or he could have sold the company after he'd done the sequels, and his grand vision could have been completed. He also could have found someone else to do them for him, someone to make them the way he wanted to, or worked with someone else on them if he didn't want to take on the full burden himself. And I'm not saying that excuses anything shady Disney may have done, but again, Lucas, someone who's always had a beef with Hollywood and the way things were done and knows how shady they can be, had to know who and what he was really dealing with potentially. Anyway, what I think the true irony or funny part in all of this is that if they just made the sequel trilogy George's way, it could have ended up being a win-win situation for Disney, no matter how the trilogy was actually received. Because think about it, if the sequel trilogy gets made George's way and the majority of fans and the general audience love it, and mind you, selling the trilogy as the end of not only the Skywalker saga, but the end of the legacy of George Lucas, well, it's not only a great selling point, mind you, but would likely make fans more appreciative and more forgiving if need be, that this was the last Lucas Star Wars we'd ever get. Then Disney, having let Lucas have his last hurrah, can come in and do something completely new and different. And again, I think most fans are going to be more accepting of whatever that might be, since Lucas at least got to finish his movies. And if the opposite ended up happening, if most fans didn't like Lucas's sequel trilogy, well then Disney can take Star Wars in a different direction with the blessing of the fandom. In other words, fans would have been eager to see what could be done with Star Wars when it's out of the hands of Lucas. They would have been more welcoming of something completely new at that point without him. And I know some of you might say that's how you felt after the prequels, that you were ready for some Star Wars away from George Lucas already. Problem is, that's not what Disney did with Episode 7, gave us something new I mean. Instead, they basically tried to retell the original story of Star Wars, prioritizing getting the look and feel right over creating something that built upon what had come before. And honestly, that was about the dumbest thing they could have done. I mean, either give us more George Lucas Star Wars from him, or actually move away from him and his story and do your own thing. Don't try to recreate his work or make something that looks like it, and be surprised when a lot of fans, not to mention George Lucas himself, end up not liking it and feeling betrayed. Well, that's all I've got for you this time. I don't really have more to say about this right now. It's just a sad story and makes me wish I could someday, somehow read those outlines Lucas wrote for the sequel trilogy, though I highly doubt that's something that would ever leak out. Anyway, now is your turn to let me know how you think and feel about all this. So leave a comment below and let's talk some Star Wars. And until next time, thanks for watching.